He's the author of the bestseller Heroic Leadership, and more recently has written a book on the leadership style of Pope Francis. He also chairs the board of an organization called Catholic Health Initiatives, which is one of America's largest not-for-profit healthcare systems, with more than 80 hospitals and $10.7 billion in annual revenues. I'm talking, of course, about Chris Lowney. We're very, very lucky to have Chris with us today. So, Chris.
Hey, Chris, thanks for coming in. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I want to invite us to think a little bit about leadership. And let's have a show of hands about a few questions. Let's imagine the world today and the world about 30 years ago. Most of you weren't alive, but you can read history books. If you think the world today is faster paced than the world about 30 years ago, why don't you raise your hand? Okay, that's 81.2%. If you think the world today is more complex than the world about 30 years ago, why don't you raise your hand? 84%. If you think in the course of running your organization or running your life, you have to cope with more change or make more decisions, raise your hand. Okay. That seems absurd, but this is why we need to talk about leadership. I started working at JP Morgan in 1983. And in 1983, when we used the word leadership, what came to our minds generally was a person, chairman of JP Morgan. And in 1983, the world was still straightforward enough that one person or a small group of people could make many of the important decisions you need to make to run even a global organization. And then in the course of the 80s and 90s, the world became, as we all raised our hands about, very fast, very complex, lots of decisions. And the idea that one person or a small group of people might make most of the important decisions seemed absolutely absurd to us. And so even the idea of the word leadership kind of changed in our minds. And it was no longer the case that we thought about a person, but instead we thought about a behavior. As in, look, my friend, I'm sitting in New York City, you're the guy in Tokyo. I don't understand the situation there. We need you to please show some leadership. And when you have environments of a lot of complexity, a lot of change, a lot of decisions, you need a very widely distributed notion of leadership. And I wonder, let's move along with our thought experiment here. I wonder how we think about the quality of leadership that we actually have right now. There was a survey that was done in the United States a few years ago, and people were asked if they had a great deal of confidence in leaders in certain sectors of society. So how about if we replicate that survey right now? So if you have a great deal of confidence in your political leaders, why don't you raise your hand? Microphone working. If you have a great deal of confidence in your business sector leaders, please raise your hand. All right, we're up to 0.5%. If you have a great deal of confidence in your education sector leaders, please raise your hand. And if you have a great deal of confidence in your religious leaders, please raise your hand. All right, we're so pessimistic here in Krakow. I'm from the USA, the land of the great optimist. So now let me show you what is the correct answer to this survey. I won't comment, I just let you read it. Okay, now look, this was 2007, when the world was still relatively okay. So we can imagine if this survey were done again today, all of these numbers would absolutely have to be lower, right? I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine a case in which more people would be confident now. So in terms of the story that we're creating for ourselves, when you live in an era of a lot of complexity and change, you need really good leadership, and we do not feel very good about the quality of leadership we actually have, So what would be better? What would be better? Let's make this part 3 of our little mental experiment. And I want to invite each of us for a few quiet seconds to think of the names of 1 or 2 living people that you would consider to be leaders, And why do you think of that name? So let's also think about the qualities or attributes or characteristics that you associate with good leadership. And I'll just give you 10 or 15 quiet seconds to think. And how about if I give you 30 more seconds? Why don't you share the names, ideas you came up with somebody on either side of you, and then I'm going to turn off the slides and talk for about 15 minutes. Okay, why don't you share the names and ideas you came up with? Let's come back together again. And who are our leaders? I'm sure people thought of very interesting names. I wonder who thought about their own name. I guess nobody or next to nobody, or probably if you thought of your own name, you did not turn to the person next to you and say me. Okay? We're raised in a culture that teaches us to be modest people, and modesty is a beautiful and important virtue in an organization. And your modesty is absolutely correct, but your stereotype of leadership is a little bit broken. Which is to say, when I ask you to think about leaders, intuitively, instinctively, people tend to think about people who are famous. Chief executive, general, pope, and so on. And that notion of leadership is not the solution to anybody's problems. In whatever company you work in my old J.P. Morgan, in the Jesuits where I was a seminarian. In fact, in a world that is complex and changing fast, that notion of leadership, in fact, is part of the problem. And I want to suggest that the first people we need to think about as leaders, in fact, are ourselves, and I'll explain why in a minute. And what do good leaders do to motivate the people around them? That was part 2 of the experiment. I'm sure people come up with great ideas: decisiveness, honor, courage. I wonder who thought of this idea articulated by somebody with great credentials. He said this: you must love those you lead before you can be an effective leader. The person I just quoted was General Eric Shinseki. Until a few years ago, he was the highest ranking military officer in the United States. And the first time I heard it, that quote struck me as odd, coming from a military class that we all typically associate with macho, being tough. Or maybe not so out of place, because the more I thought about it, the more I suspect that, in fact, generals make better choices. If they love the people they must place into difficulty. And I also suspect that soldiers are performing better if they believe they're valued in a very deep way by the people who have the terrible job of sending them out, possibly to face their death. So who's a leader? And how are leaders leading? Well, we're all leading, well or poorly, all the time. And our claim to leadership is not our status, our platform. Our claim to leadership is what we do with our platform. Now, this sounds like an American gimmick to sell books. It's not. If you look in a dictionary, you'll see different definitions of the word leadership. Those definitions will always include this one: to point out a way, direction, or goal, and to influence others toward it. And isn't it true that everybody here is doing those words all the time? We're pointing out a way, we're role modeling a way by virtue of how we work, how we treat the people in the next cubicle, how we treat customers, whether we're willing to go the extra mile or whether we cheat, whether we're willing to help people do a better job or whether we're more interested in screwing them. A lot of people here are parents, and could there be any more obvious example of pointing a way and influencing others than what parents do for children in the course of a lifetime? So by the dictionary definition, not some gimmickry of mine, good parenting, good leadership. But though all of us are leading, most of us are doing so only subconsciously. In other words, we're not going around all day thinking, oh, I'm a leader and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not suggesting you do that, but I am suggesting that we all need to spend a little bit of time every once in a while reflecting on the fact that we have a leadership opportunity and responsibility. Not if I become department head, not if I run the company, not if I start my own company, right now, whatever I'm doing. And I want to mention briefly 4 ideas, 4 values that somebody might think about incorporating in their leadership statement that is their life. Not the only ones, not the best ones, but ideas that in a way are product of my own background. So you heard I was a Jesuit seminarian for about half a dozen years, and then I worked at J.P. Morgan for about 17 years. You may know that the mission of a religious order and an investment bank are actually different. At least we hope so. But you know something, there is, whether it's in a religious order, an investment bank, a family, in many ways, great leadership is great leadership. There are some of the same things that have to go on in any kind of a human organization. We've got to set goals and reach them. We have to develop plans and figure out how to implement them. We're going to have to motivate ourselves and other people. And it struck me that in all kinds of organizations, people who do that well tend to have some set of values that characterize them, including 4, I want to mention that they're somehow heroic, and that they're self-aware, and they're ingenious, and they're loving. I'm going to define each of those, and then I think in the time I have, we'll just talk about 2. So one, the idea of being heroic. In order, people who are leading well, they are motivating themselves by a real desire to excel. And most importantly, by goals that are bigger than their own ego. It's not about them. And self-awareness. In order to lead well, you need to know yourself. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are your values? What's your outlook on the world? And third, ingenuity. As we've just heard for the last 50 minutes from these 2 great speakers, the world is going to keep changing. And only people who are willing to keep adapting to a changing world are leading well. And finally, love. That we treat other people in a way that respects their dignity and tries to unlock their human potential. Now, let me talk only about 2 of these ideas. I'm going to talk a bit about heroism and a bit about self-awareness. And when I say heroism, I'm sure what we all start to think about is something dramatic like saving somebody in a battlefield. But isn't it true that most of us cannot control the opportunities life gives us? I don't know if I ever am going to save somebody who's in distress. The only thing we always control, on the other hand, is how we think and how we behave, how we react in front of whatever opportunities life gives us. And let's be frank, for most of us, the opportunities life gives us are small. And our heroism is not going to be something that we win in one spectacular moment that everybody's going to watch on television. Instead, our heroism is going to be able to look back on a life of very patient, dedicated, high-quality work with a lot of integrity. That's the heroism of a parent, a teacher, and for most people in most jobs on earth. Another aspect of heroism is what I mentioned in the definition, that you realize it's about something bigger than you, and I want to use an anecdote from U.S. history to get at this idea. A couple of us here remember the early 1960s. The rest of you read about it in history books. And you know that Russia and the United States were racing to get a rocket to the moon first, right? And there's a story, apocryphal, who knows if it's true, that President Kennedy at one point visits the space agency to boost morale, I guess. And at some moment, he happens to run into a janitor who's cleaning up an office. And I guess to be polite, he says to the guy, "So what's your job here?" And the guy says to him, "Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon." Okay, I'm from New York City. We don't want any part of this gee whiz team spirit stuff. But I know, and everybody here knows, that the teams that perform best, whether it's my old J.P. Morgan, the places you work, are teams where people get over themselves and appreciate this is not all about you. It's not all about being the salesperson, the finance manager. It's not all about being in charge of the office in Krakow or headquarters in London. Rather, teams of any kind only win if you can get a critical mass of people who are willing to invest some of their ego, some of their talent, some of their time, some of their energy in some mission that's worthy of their allegiance and that is bigger than any one person's ego. And getting to that point of view is a really tough job in a world where there is so much ambition and fear and money and power and greed at stake. And there's an incredible gravitational pull to think only about yourself, and it's really tough to think about the mission first, and it's really heroic when people are willing to do that. And getting to think that way is a self-awareness job. So now I want to talk about self-awareness for a few minutes. So anybody who's managed a lot of people or worked in a human resources department, I did both of those things in the course of the years I was at Morgan, has been mystified by this phenomenon of rising junior corporate stars who all of a sudden flame out. In the time I was at Morgan, we hired a lot of the smartest kids in America. They all want to come to Wall Street and get rich. That plan worked well until about 2008. And they all did very well when the only thing we asked them to do was move numbers around Excel spreadsheets. And invariably, some of them started to flame out as soon as we asked them to start doing grown-up things, like dealing with other human beings, or dealing with problems that don't have easy solutions. And one of the things you quickly realize in business life is that most problems do not have easy solutions, and many problems have no solutions. And so you need people who have judgment and courage. In other words, judgment, the ability to say, okay, I cannot prove any one of our three alternative paths is the best, but I have reasons for believing this one is the best, and then they have courage. In other words, they don't factually know this is the best way, but this is the way we're going to go. And I know there are 50 people working for me, and I'm going to look stupid in front of 50 people if I'm wrong. And you may know that there's a school of thought that attributes this inability to develop judgment and courage to lack of a certain kind of self-awareness. In other words, what sometimes happens is that very smart people, now I talk exactly to people in this room who work in the kind of companies that you work in, or alphas, to use a term that's come up before. What sometimes happens is that very smart people quickly figure out how to do school. They never figure out how to do life until it's too late. What I mean is this. Because you're smart, school comes relatively easy. You get good grades, teachers like you, other students like you, you're able to coast a little bit, and you never really experience the kind of failure or difficulty or challenge or setback that forces people to develop what in corporate life we called learning agility, to be agile. In other words, to learn from your own mistakes, to fail and keep going, to accept feedback from other people. Some of you probably know of Abraham Zelznick, who worked at Harvard in the business school for many years, and he also worked one-on-one with a lot of chief executives in a kind of a coaching capacity, and he made a very interesting observation that a large share of these people, in his words, were twice born. Interesting phrase. He didn't mean it in the religious sense we might guess. Rather, this is what he meant. He noticed how many of them, early in their adulthoods, had suffered some kind of a crisis. You're an alcoholic, you get fired, your family breaks up, your business fails, whatever. And this experience totally knocks him down and makes him say, look, who the heck am I and what do I want out of my life? And his thesis was that, in fact, it was exactly that experience that explained their long-term success. Because it ended up giving them a real solid core. A sense of, look, this is who I am, this is what I think my life is about, these are the things I stand for. And anybody here who has done anything difficult, ambitious, knows that you don't accomplish it unless you have a solid core. Because doing difficult things means failure, challenge, people don't like it, and if you don't have some solidity, there's no way that you get through all that. So the first point I want to make about self-awareness is that we all need to make some kind of a foundational investment in figuring out who we are and what life is about and what we stand for. And sometimes that happens for people through a crisis or difficulty or challenge at work. But if life does not thrust that moment of self-scrutiny on us through a crisis, we all need to have some mechanism, some process of figuring these kinds of things out. And of course, every religious tradition helps people to do that, and every humanistic tradition helps people to do that. So we have to make a foundational investment in knowing ourselves, and then we also need to have some kind of a mechanism to keep ourselves updated on how we're doing. And I want to paraphrase for you a very simple daily tool that they taught us when I was in seminary, that anybody here could begin doing in less than 15 minutes a day if you want. Take 2 mental pit stops. Let's imagine 5 minutes after lunch, 5 minutes at the end of the day. And during those few minutes, I'm going to do 3 things. One, I'm going to remind myself, why am I grateful as a human being? And then second, I'm going to try to lift my horizon a little bit. Lift my horizon, in other words, I spend the whole day thinking about what email do I have to answer now and what am I going to have for lunch, and this guy cut me off at the intersection. And instead, let me forget all that crap and try to think a bit about, why am I here on earth anyway? And what's the most important thing I have to do to improve myself? And what was my biggest objective for myself this year? And then third, I'm going to go back mentally through the last few hours, and I'm going to try to take away some little lesson that might help me in the next few hours. So, I don't know what, I was irritated all morning, and I was snapping at the people who work for me and what was going on there. And maybe I can get over that and get back into the game. Or if I'm a spiritual person, maybe I'm going to go back through the last few hours and try to perceive how a higher power or God was trying to be present to me or present to me in the people I met and the problems I had to deal with. I think the genius of this very simple practice becomes obvious when we think about the chaotic lifestyles we're all trying to lead. We're floating along on this river of email, text, meeting, distraction, phone call, iPod, and you get to the end of the workday and you never get to your number one priority. Or a meeting goes badly at 8:30. I spend the whole day thinking, I wish I said this at 8:30. Well, these are self-awareness problems. And we need to give ourselves some kind of tools or mechanisms that are going to keep us on track every day. Last couple of minutes, last idea. This is a bonus track. I want to talk to you about courage, because without courage, nothing that I said works. And I want to talk about courage in a different kind of way than we typically think about it. And first, let me let you read that quote. So I remember when this guy came out of jail. And I remember those first few months, and that was an incredible performance. And I remember thinking very well, what incredible natural gifts this guy has, what natural charisma, what natural grace, what natural confidence, what natural fearlessness. And then many years later, I was reading some interview or article about him, and it had this quote. And I felt like the guy is smacking me in the head. As if to say, okay, Chris, my friend, you somehow think that I had all this natural self-confidence and therefore everything in South Africa came easily for me. No, I'm sorry, my friend, I was afraid. So now, Chris, tell me what's your big excuse in life. And let me tell you something. I've had the privilege of working alongside a lot of very successful people in 3 continents in various industries. And I can tell you that almost without exception, everybody's afraid. And nobody has enough self-confidence. The people who have enough self-confidence are the narcissists. And they're not the solution here, they're part of the problem. But for the rest of us, if you have any modicum of self-awareness, you know that you don't feel completely up to the task that you're called on to do in life. And so for me, courage doesn't mean that one day we're all going to wake up and suddenly have no fears and all the confidence we need. Instead, courage is, despite my fears and lack of confidence, I also understand that I'm smart and that I have some wisdom. I've learned some things through life. And I have some talents. And there are things I can contribute, whatever is my job right now. And I'm going to find it within myself to make those contributions. So let me wish you all the best of luck as you make yourselves and your families and this community and your companies into places where there's really great leadership. And thank you very much for listening.